Ladies and gentlemen, the event is about to begin, so if we can just remind you to turn off your mobile phones, please. And if you'd welcome me in welcoming Professor Petley to the stage.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and welcome everyone. So I'm Dave Petley. I have the honour and privilege to be the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Hull. So welcome to you all, and thank you so very much for joining us here for this autumn edition of the Inspired in Hull series. This is a series that we deliver twice per year, and it's organised by the university's alumni team. The lecture series seeks to bring back to campus those graduates who have created something special or who've become a household name. We seek to celebrate those who embody the spirit of the city and of the University of Hull. And after almost 100 years after its foundation, the University of Hull continues to transform the lives of its students, advance the boundaries of knowledge, and we play a leading role in the heart of the Humber region. We are widely recognised for our inclusivity and friendliness, and we continue to pursue a truly remarkable student experience for all. So our guest tonight is the Right Honourable Alan Johnson, who is an honorary graduate of the university. He was General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union before entering Parliament as Labour MP for Hull West and Hessel in 1997. He served as Home Secretary, perhaps a little less controversially than the current incumbent. And he held a wide variety of other senior cabinet positions in both the Blair and Brown governments, including Health Secretary and Education Secretary, perhaps a little less controversially than the current incumbents. Alan retired before the 2017 general election after 20 years as an MP. Beyond his Westminster career, Alan is an award-winning writer. His series of memoirs have won such prizes as the Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize, the Orwell Prize, the National Book Club Award for Best Biography, and the Parliamentary Book Award for Best Memoir. He has since gone on to publish 2 novels and continues to work on future projects. Many of you will have taken the opportunity to get a signed copy or 2 of his back catalogue tonight, and I believe our friends from Beverley Bookstore will be here after the event should you wish to add a title or 2 to your collection. Not only is Alan a celebrated author, he's often on our TV screens. He spent 8 years on the BBC's This Week with Andrew Neil and Michael Portillo, and now appears regularly with Steph McGovern on Channel 4's Steph's Packed Lunch. But tonight, and for one night only, he joins us on stage, live in the Middleton Hall. Joining Alan is my colleague, Pro Vice-Chancellor for Education, Becky Huxley-Binns. Becky will act as interviewer and will navigate her way through some of the questions that were submitted earlier. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Right Honourable Alan Johnson and Professor Becky Huxley-Binns.
Thank you.
Many of us here might know you as a politician, as an author, and perhaps we're starting to get to know you now as Chancellor of the University of Hull. But I want to start the evening with an introduction to you, the man. So my first question is going to be about music, and that's not just because of The Masked Singer. Music's a really important part of your life. You've been in 2 bands, and one of your memoirs, In My Life, is subtitled A Music Memoir, and in it you talk about the soundtrack to your life. We could probably spend the whole evening talking about music, but that's not what we've advertised. But to get us going, what songs give us an insight into Alan Johnson, the man?
Which song? Insight into Alan Johnson. First of all, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for coming, and it's one of my proudest achievements to be the Chancellor of University of Hull. The song, Sum Up My Life, Help, I think, would probably be a good one. If I could have a trilogy, I suppose it's Help, Magical Mystery Tour, and Paperback Writer.
Nice.
Beatles tracks, in case you didn't know. But they would sum things up. Perhaps A Hard Day's Night, but give me a bit of time.
Nicely done. So you need to know that one he had the heads up on.
And I don't want you to make light of my music career, by the way. I made a record when I was 16, which you can still get on YouTube. My strong advice is not to, with a band called The Area. Then I was in a band called The In-Betweens. And I felt I was a really good songwriter. The memoir you refer to, my music memoir, is 25 years from my earliest music memory when I was 8. And I heard a record played on two-way family favourites on a Sunday morning for those of a certain generation. For 25 years that I thought I was going to be a rock star or a songwriter, until when I was 32, I sat down with an acoustic guitar and the newly kind of provided compact audio cassette and recorded 5 of my wonderful songs, sent them off to Elvis Costello, got the address at Stiff Records on the back. I was a big Elvis Costello fan. And as I say in the book, I'm still waiting for a reply. But what is more amazing is one of those songs was a song I wrote when I was 18 about, called Bad Skin, about a lad with acne. I've got acne, I've got eczema, I've got every skin disease. Gives me pimples I can pick, gives me blackheads I can squeeze. Oh. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that's Dylan-esque. But the genius lay in the middle 8. The middle 8 of Bad Skin was, how can any girl want to be with you when every kiss she gets just tastes of Nivea? Genius or what? And I've looked at every Elvis Costello album just to see if he's stolen that.
It's worth checking.
But not so far. No.
Well, he's going to wait for that one, isn't he? He's keeping that in his back pocket.
Yeah.
So in advertising our event tonight, we've made some very big promises to our audience. Fascinating stories from your political life and your life before politics. And I know we haven't overpromised because you have so many stories in This Boy, which was described as the best memoir by a politician you will read, and in Please, Mr. Postman. So you grew up in a world that may be hard to imagine for some members of the audience. The slums of West London. You experienced great tragedy at a young age. And This Boy has also been described as the story of 2 remarkable women, your mother Lily and your sister Linda. So how did these early experiences and these 2 remarkable people shape you as a person and perhaps later as a politician?
Oh, I think we owe everything to our childhood. My mother came from a family of 11 in Liverpool. Her father was Scottish, her mother was Irish. And her mother had 11 children by the age of 38. This wasn't uncommon. My mother was born in 1921. Big families in working class communities were very common. So her mother had 11 children by the age of 38, died when she was 42. Her mother, my mother's maternal grandmother, had died at the age of 42. And my mother was always convinced there was some curse of the female line that meant she would die when she was 42 as well, and she did. She had a heart condition called mitral stenosis, which meant she shouldn't have been living in the slums we were living in. And these slums were everywhere. I mean, they were in Hull, they were in Leeds, they were in Manchester. Post-war, there was not only the problem of building houses, which was a problem anyway, there was the number of houses that had been destroyed in the war. I mean, I know all about that in Hull, the most heavily bombed city per head of population in the country. So she shouldn't have been living in those terrible conditions. She'd left Liverpool to come to London to work in the NAFI when the Second World War broke out when she was 18. And I could easily, her first boyfriend, who she was really, really struck on, was a guy called Les Foster from Hull. And what happened was her younger sister, Dolly, followed my mum 2 years later. When she got to 18, Dolly followed Lily down to London to join the NAFI. and she nicked Les Foster off my mum. No. Oh, I tell you what, it caused such a rift.
Well, I'm feeling it now.
For 10 years, they didn't talk to each other. No. So my only visit to Hull before I came here to stand as the Labour candidate for Hull West and Hessle was on a cold train from King's Cross. Me and my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, and my mum coming up here as part of the peace process to see Dolly, the first time they'd seen each other since the rift. Yeah. But my auntie Dolly moved here after the war. She married Les Foster from Hull, moved here, had 9 kids, which meant when I was asked to go, and my predecessor as the MP for Hull West and Hessle stepped down to spend more time with his peerage just before the general election. And I was asked to come up here. And I figured, with the number of cousins, I've got a built-in majority up here anyway. But they all lived on the Greatfield Estate or East Hull, or none of them lived in my constituency. One lived in my constituency. So anyway, she'd had a very hard life. Now, here's the thing about my mother. She dragged me and my sister to Ladbroke Grove Library almost as soon as we were old enough to turn a page. Now, this is, early 1950s. You can read lots of stuff now, and there's lots of eminent professors at this university who would tell you that disadvantages amongst children, the fact that a kid born in Hull will die on average 7 years before a child born in Beverley, the fact that where we lived, North Kensington, which is where Grenfell Tower is, a boy born in North Kensington, as I was, will die on average 16 years before a boy born in South Kensington. That's one London borough. South Kensington is Harrods, the Albert Hall. North Kensington is where we live, still a very poor area, Grenfell Tower and all that. So these differences don't start when a child's 10 or 12 or thinking about whether they're going to go to university, which happens a lot earlier than when they're 18. Yeah. They happen between the ages of 18 months and 2 years and 2.5 years. They happen, it's early years. And so people now know if you can get words into a child's head as early as possible, if you can get them reading before they start school. My mother was really, really keen on us seeing books and, getting acquainted with books. So we were dragged to Ladbroke Grove Library. How did she know that? She had no books in her life. She had a very, very hard life. That to me was the biggest gift she could give me, because really I'm autodidactic. I left school at 15 with no qualifications whatsoever, wasn't allowed to take even mock O levels because I was leaving at 15 and I had to stay on at 16 to do that. So with no qualifications and a very short education at a not very good grammar school, I have to say. People laud grammar schools as if they were wonderful institutions. They should have been at mine, Sloane School in Chelsea. Without books, none of what's happened to me, the good things that have happened to me, including Chancellor of this university, would have ever happened. And that was my mother instilled that in me. Now, sorry, this will be a long answer, but as for my sister, who has lived in Australia now for the last 40 years, me and my sister my sister kind of brought me up because my mum's heart condition meant she was in hospital every 5 minutes. My father ran off when I was 8 and we were pleased to see the back of him. He used to come home drunk, beat my mother up, but he was a pub pianist and he ran off with the barmaid of the lads at the village pub when I was 8. And my sister and I always say it's one of the happiest days of our lives. But for my mother, of course, it was the start of a whole new era of difficulties, because in the 50s, and it's worth I say this to my daughters just to remind them, a married woman in the 50s couldn't sign a hire purchase agreement or even rent a telly without her husband being there to countersign it. Divorce was very rare. There was no child support agency. Anyway, he went and we were pleased to see the back of him. But my sister, when my mum was in hospital, my sister was bringing me up. In this boy, my childhood memoir, I describe how when my father was still there, he disappeared off with his girlfriend for Christmas. My mum was in hospital. My sister, 8, and me, 5, were left on our own all Christmas, left on our own. Linda cooked my Christmas dinner, and it's the worst meal I've ever had in my life. I still castigate her about it. But she got the hamper that everyone used to put sort of threepence a week into our Christmas hamper club. And my mum had told my sister to go and pick up the hamper, which usually had a Dundee cake and a few other bits and pieces in it, and to get the chicken from the butcher. You got a little voucher to get the chicken. My sister didn't realise you had to take the cellophane off the chicken before you put it in the oven. So we went off to see our mum in hospital, because the only time you were allowed to visit was an hour on Christmas Day, and came back and the dinner was burnt. So, and I still had to eat it because my sister made me. Anyway, she was incredible, was Linda. And I'll just tell this one anecdote and then we'll move on to more frivolous stuff maybe. But so when my mother died at age 42 on the operating table, when they were trying to fix it's a common operation now. Her problem was the mitral valve that separates the two chambers of the heart was clogged, and she had to go and get it cleared. And this brand new operation at Hammersmith Hospital, which was near to where we lived, but is a world-renowned, still is, cardiac hospital, had this new operation where they replace the valve with an imitation one. And it would be, she was told, my mother was told that you live another 20 years. You know, if you don't have this operation, you'll die young. Anyway, she didn't survive the operation. Me and my sister were living in just about where Grenfell Tower is now. They pulled down our house to build Grenfell Tower. And I said to Linda, what do we do now? You know, I was 13, she was 15, just coming on 16. She said, don't say anything. Say nothing to the authorities. She always said, the authorities. Or they'll separate us and they'll put us in homes. So I said nothing at my school. Linda's strategy was fine. She had left school at 15 to train to be a nursery nurse, and we just kept stum. Then they were pulling our street down, and it was difficult to stay off the radar then. And a letter came through the door addressed to my mother, Mrs. Lillian Johnson, who'd been dead for months by then, offering her a council house. My mum had dreamt of her own council house. The only way out of those slums, you could never buy a house in those days. Particularly my mother, on her own, scraping, doing charring jobs to scrape money together. The dream was of a council house, her own front door, instead of sharing a house, you know, 4 to a room, and in the end, 2 rooms and, you know, 8 families on 3 floors. Here was the offer of a council house. My sister marched round to the council. She's pretty fearsome, my sister. And she said, my mother's dead, but we'll have this. She had this quite naive thing that it kind of was for the family, that you inherited your place in the queue for a council house. The council official said, I mean, the age of majority then was 21. It hadn't come down to 18. He said, look, 2 bits of kids, we'll send someone round. And into our life came Mr. Pepper. Mr. Pepper was the social worker, a hero to me and my sister. But it started off badly, because he came into the front room at 6 Walmer Road, where we lived then. Crappy little place, but a bit more salubrious than the slum we'd been in before in Southam Street. And Mr. Pepper made this little presentation. I can see him now. He had sandy hair and a white Mac, and he was very posh. His name was Julian. You never had anyone called Julian round our way, any men called Julian. And he said, I've sorted it out. Alan, you'll go to foster parents near your school in Chelsea. Linda, you can go to Dr. Bernardo's, where you'll live in, and they'll continue your training to be a nursery nurse. And he stood back, Mr. Pepper, I think expecting a round of applause. Instead of that, my sister tore into him, finger jabbing under poor old Mr. Pepper's nose, hand on hip, you are not going to separate us. Mr. Pepper goes away with this Linda-shaped flea in his ear and comes back a little while later and said, okay, I've convinced the council they're going to give you a flat. His argument to them was that Linda had been looking after me for so long anyway, that they weren't taking a huge risk. Got a council place. Linda goes off to look at it. I didn't see it. Mr. Pepper didn't go with her. The council must have thought 2 bits of kids were given the worst place that we can't get rid of to anyone else. They weren't figuring on my sister. She told me that this place, you know, the previous occupants had taken off the doors to burn as firewood. We'd been in some terrible places This was horrible. She went straight over to the phone box, put her fourpence in, for those of my generation who remember, pressed button A when Mr. Pepper answered, and said, we're not accepting this. Mr. Pepper said, Linda, do you know what I've been through to get you this? And she said, well, you go and look at it. If you think you can live there with your family, come and look me in the eye and tell me. And we never heard of that place again. Mr. Pepper got us a 2-bedroom maisonette, lovely indoor toilet, indoor bathroom, never had those before. Number 11, this is quite strange actually, number 11 Pitt House on the Wilberforce estate.
Wow.
In Battersea. It meant we had to go south of the Thames, and that was terrible for us, but we got over that. And we lived there very happily for me still at school and then leaving school until my sister got married when in 1966 she got married to dear Mike, my brother-in-law, who had put a down payment on a 3-bedroom house in Watford where he came from. And Linda said, right, we've got a bedroom for you. You're going to move with us to Watford. I said, I'm not moving to the north. And I went back and lived with a family who were friends of my mother, who fitted me in with their 2 sons when I was 16. And by now I was in a band and we were taking off. The area was doing really well. And they were kind enough to let me stay with their 2 sons and share a bedroom. And then I was living in digs from the age of 17. But those were really difficult years, and if Mr. Pepper hadn't been there, who'd come round every 5 minutes to make sure we were okay. I mean, he'd have lost his job. If I'd have been shooting heroin in a back street, you know, the blame would have been on Mr. Pepper, the welfare officer, who, you know, let the family down and all that. But the one decision by someone in authority who listened to us, not that he had much choice of listening to my sister, but who listened to us was what changed our life. And you know, this boy is dedicated to my sister, who I say who kept me safe, and she did.
Brilliant. I do hope that Linda's going to watch the recording. Right, here's to you.
Yeah, she's coming over. I'll introduce you to her. 2 strong women together. She's coming over next year.
Love to. So let's delve in a little bit into your life before politics. So you were a postman, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, and rose up the ranks of your union at a time when Thatcherism was reshaping the country and the economy in ways that I think still have reverberations. You were building a secure life then for your own family, using your position to represent the workers in the union, and there was a lot of social change happening around you. So what was your life like back then? How did you navigate all of those changes as a father, a worker, and as a trade unionist?
Oh no, these were all good things that were happening. You whisked over my musical career, I saw very quickly there, Becky. So I left school at 15, stacked shelves in Tesco's, but I was going to be a rock star with the area. Then the area had all their gear nicked. This crime wave was following me around. I'd taken home my guitar that night, and so they didn't get that. My Hofner very thin, beautiful, cherry red, mother of pearl inlay. Anyway, I won't go on about it, but guitarists will know what I mean. I love that guitar. But I'd taken it home with me that night. And then a band came to me, a semi-professional, had a manager called the In-Betweens, and asked me to join them. And the bass guitarist was a great friend of mine, West Indian guy called Sham. He was a postman, semi-professional. He worked as a postman. And the In-Betweens were doing, they had a singer called Carmen, who was half Guyanese and half Indian, and she was the most beautiful vision of loveliness I'd ever seen. And it was unusual to have a multiracial band at those times. The Equals were the only ones, if anyone remembers them, and to have a girl singer. It was very unusual. And so there was a lot of interest in us. We used to stack our gear over the top of a pub called the Pied Horse in Islington, and one night it all got nicked. We thought it was the landlord of the pub, but apparently the police were not making any further inquiries. So that was my guitar gone then. Sham wanted me to start another band with him. I was going to get married when I was 18, and I said to Sham, to a single mother, I said to Sham, I've got to find a job. He said, why don't you come and join the post office? He says, lousy wages. But he said, because it's lousy wages, they can't recruit anyone. there's loads of overtime. If you're willing to do the hours, you can earn a decent whack. Yeah. They had this thing, some people might remember this, it was, because the post office was the civil service then. It was the general post office. You wore a blue serge uniform with a red stripe, and you signed the Official Secrets Act, and you were civil servants. I met many mandarins in Whitehall when I was a minister, who'd started their lives as telegram boys or telephonists or postmen. And when you got to 21, you could take the civil service exam and kind of move anywhere within the civil service. So it's amazing. But, you know, that was a long time ago. That was in 1968. So I joined the civil service. One of the best things I ever did, became a postman. And then a few years later, a guy called KK Sharma, who was, by now I'd transferred to Slough. Yeah. So whereas my mum waited all those years, dreaming of a council house, never got one, died before she could get a council house. For me, this is how lucky my life has been compared to hers. Me and my first wife waited a year, then they were building the A40 extension into London, pulling down all these houses in what's now called Notting Hill, but was actually North Kensington, and they had to offer us a council house. And it was in Slough, huge council estate called the Britwell Estate in Slough. And we moved there. I transferred with the post office and became a postman in Slough. And every year, you'd have these nomination sheets for the local branch of the Union of Post Office Workers. And KK Sharma, a friend of mine, like many Slough postmen, he'd come in temporarily. He was from the Indian subcontinent. KK, I think, was from India itself. And had come in temporarily while they retrained. These people, some of them were doctors, some of them were teachers, some of them were university professors, but their qualifications didn't count in the UK. So they came into the post office temporarily, and in Slough there were loads of people like this. And KK said, why don't you put your name down? I'll nominate you to be the branch chairman. I thought, yeah, great. I had a council house now, unlike my mother. Front garden, back garden, beautiful, lovely council estate. I mean, Please Mr. Postman, my second memoir, is trying to kind of recapture the council estate, which seems to have fallen, you know, people, mainly because of Mrs. Thatcher, anyone who lived in a council house was meant to be a loser. Yeah. Well, we weren't losers. And, you know, the council house gave us a lovely grounding for our family. So by now I had 3 children. I put my name forward for branch chairman. I got it. And this whole new world of educational opportunities opened up. This cornucopia of educational opportunities were falling on my head because of the trade union movement. So I always kept reading. I'd become very, very interested in politics, mainly because of the one good teacher at Sloane Grammar School was a guy called Mr. Carlin, who I dedicated my first work of fiction to. Peter Carlin, he was our English teacher. And he got all us boys aged 14, reading Animal Farm by George Orwell and explaining the subtext of the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, this was at a time, this was a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a world we were going out into where a third of the world lived under communism. And it was a really, really useful piece of education from Mr. Carlin. And then I went and read 1984, and I read the other Orwell stuff. So I was into politics. Mr. Carlin, incidentally, still alive, 95 years of age. I invited him to my book launch for The Late Train to Gypsy Hill, who I dedicated to him. Yeah. And he was too frail to come. He lives down in Bath. But he sent me a little video message that his son emailed to me. And I heard his voice. Mr. Carlin, this was the age of corporal punishment. Every teacher at Sloane was licensed to beat you. I got caned for wearing red socks. I got caned for growing my hair too long. I got caned for being late. You know, they'd cane you on the slightest opportunity. Mr. Carlin never used the cane. Mr. Carlin's voice carried an authority that you sat and listened. It was a mellifluous voice. And he introduced us to poetry, Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth that he chalked on the blackboard. And all of these, he took some of us kids to the theatre for the first time at his own expense for first time in our lives. Tommy Steele in Half a Sixpence and Spike Milligan in Oblomov, Mr. Carlin took us to. Anyway, the point I'm making here was he carried on my education because he gave all us boys 30 books we had to read in our lives. And I took it seriously. And I'd read them all by, thanks to Ladbroke Grove Library, by the age of about 20, and so I was interested in politics. Unlike Harold Wilson, who never got past the first page of Das Kapital, I actually was reading that at the time, although I was never, you can see rubbish online that said that I used to be a communist or I was part of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. I never was, because Orwell was a bigger influence on me than Marx or anybody else. Orwell, of course, in Animal Farm and 1984, is a man on the left, a socialist, is warning against totalitarianism, whether it's of the left, communism, or the right, fascism. And that warning, that idea that the secret police will be knocking on your door, interfering with your lives to a huge degree, always stayed with me. I joined the Labour Party in the end. But on this opportunity, when I became the branch chairman of the Slough Amalgamated Branch of the Union of Post Office Workers, suddenly I had access to all these correspondence courses. I'm sorry about this, I sound really ancient. In this pre-computer age, you sent away for a correspondence course, all done, the TUC paid for it all, it didn't cost you a penny, all done through a little town in Clackmannanshire called Tillicoultry. And you'd apply on a course. I did a course in English, I did a course in geography, I did another course in collective bargaining. You could do all these courses and your lecturer would come all through Tillicoultry. I think they probably worked in universities all around, but Tillicoultry was the kind of postbox for it all. And I took all these courses, and then you could go to union residential courses, and the union, of course, was involved in Ruskin College, Oxford. You could take courses there, not that I ever did, because I had a young family, but I could have done, thanks to the trade union movement. So it's one of the untold stories of social mobility in this country, were trade unions taking kids like me, who'd left with no qualifications, and training us in public speaking, training us in negotiating, training us in the written word, which is crucially important if you're writing, with a pay claim or whatever. And that was enormously influential. So you ask how I managed it, Becky. It was glorious. It was wonderful. These were the opportunities my mother never had. Living in a council house, bringing up 3 kids in a really nice part of Slough. The Brickwell estate was lovely. All the people around us were from West London. They were all, moved out of the slums. So it's a very happy time. And the 1970s, by the way, and we're in the 1970s now, was probably when our society became more equal than it's ever been previously or ever been since.
We might, if we have time, we'll come back to some of this.
I'll go and get me flares and my tank top and we'll make it a tribute act.
I'm going to fast forward you now to 1997. So you were selected to stand as Labour candidate for Parliament in the safe seat of Hull Western Hessel 3 weeks before the election in 97. And those of us a certain age will remember the song Things Can Only Get Better. So what vision did you have then, going in as an MP, and of the Labour government, that things were going to get better? What things?
Well, what changed my mind, first of all, to leave General Secretary of the 5th biggest affiliated union to the Labour Party to go and be a backbench MP was a Mr. Anthony Linton Blair. I was on the NEC of the Labour Party. We had a problem with one of our guys, a guy called Reg Kelly, who was a local activist down in Newport and was going to stand to be the Labour candidate. And you might remember this, there was a guy called Alan Howarth, who was a Conservative, who crossed the floor to join Labour in 97. And they were looking for a Labour seat for him. He was never going to win his Conservative seat. And the word on the grapevine was that Newport was going to be provided to Alan Howarth as his seat. So I'd got in touch with Tony Blair to say, I want it to be an open selection so that Reg Kelly, my man, stood a chance, not imposed, not Alan Howarth imposed on them. Anyway, I got a phone call from Tony's office, and I was driving up Gypsy Hill in London, where I lived at the time, and this huge thing on the seat beside me started to vibrate. It was called a mobile phone. It was about that big. And it was Angie Hunter, who was Tony's secretary and bodyguard almost. You couldn't get to Tony without going through Angie. I said, Tony wants to work with you. So I did pull over, by the way. I didn't try and talk. I pulled over on Gypsy Hill, keen to get to my mother-in-law's birthday celebration. So I was running late. Yes, Tony. I just want to reassure you, Alan, Newport's going to be fine. Reg Kelly can stand. Anyone can stand. Alan will be a candidate, whoever the members pick. I said, oh, fine. Thanks, Tony. Waiting to get on and drive home. Alan, he said, I understand that you'd like to be an MP. And I said, I don't know who told you that, Tony. I've never wanted to be an MP. It never remotely entered my mind to be an MP. And he said, well, I'd quite like you to be one. Now, I had been on a there was a Michael Cockerell television documentary that I think Tony must have seen, because it told the story of our defeat of Major and Heseltine when they tried to privatise the post office in the early 90s, which even if I say it myself, early 90s, even if I say it myself, was a brilliant campaign. I wasn't solely responsible for it, but as the General Secretary, I took the credit. And so I think he'd seen that. I'd been on the NEC. I'd been very vocal about Clause 4, for instance, which is a rather esoteric subject we won't go into. He said, I'd rather like you to. Now, he had this thing about wanting people to get into Parliament who hadn't spent their whole lives trying to get into Parliament, that had gone away and done other things. So there was another couple of people who came in as well. He was keen to get in. So, here's the leader of the Labour Party who, there's a general election got to happen by May. Yeah. This is February. Yeah. Do I want to change now? I was in my mid-40s. If I don't do it now, will I regret it for the rest of my life? So I spoke to my then wife, my second wife, and I thought, let's do it. So I said to Tony, so he'd asked me to come and see him after the NEC. So I went to see him, and I said, where would just let me know where you think this constituency would be. He said, where do you want it to be? Now, unbeknown to me, as we saw running up to the election, lots of people stood down, whether to spend more time with their peerage or whether to... He knew there were seats that were going to become vacant because the incumbent was going to retire just before polling day or coming up to polling day. So I said, well, I'm a Londoner, somewhere in London. He said, you don't want anywhere in London, Alan. He said he was an MP up in Sedgefield. You don't want anywhere in London. He said, really, you want somewhere in the north. That's where you want to be a Labour MP. That's the best place to be a Labour MP, somewhere in the north. So I sat by the phone, couldn't say a word to anyone because I was going to have to stand for re-election as General Secretary. And if it was thought I was even considering leaving the union to go and be an MP, it might not have done my chances of being re-elected as General Secretary much good. So it was all kept under wraps. And at the last minute, halfway through the 97 campaign, I got a phone call about going up to Hull. Now, where I'd been in 1955 with my sister and my mum to see my sister's Aunt Dolly and my 9 cousins. My Aunt Dolly, by the way, died the month before the general election. So otherwise, it would have been a great sort of reunion with her. And my Uncle Les, who'd been my mum's boyfriend, he had died a few years before. So it wasn't a happy reunion there. But I thought about Hull, and it was kind of no-brainer. There was Hull and there was Dudley in the Midlands. And first of all, you looked at the majorities. Then you thought, Michael Heseltine had a great story about Hull. I don't know whether it's true. You might have heard this. I hope not, because I'm going to tell it again. Heseltine, when he was made the Minister for Urban Redevelopment after the Toxteth riots, came and visited all the big northern councils and came to Hull. And they put him in the waiting room while the leader of the council was going to come and see him. And in the waiting room were photographs of all the previous mayors of Hull, Labour, 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 Labour. And when the council leader came in, Heseltine said, I noticed you haven't always had a Labour mayor. There's this period here in the 1940s when there's a Conservative mayor. And the leader of the council said, well, it was like this. The Second World War had broken out. We were expecting the Nazis to invade. We were told the first thing they did when they took over a town was take the mayor out and shoot him. And so we were forced to take precautions. Even if it's not true, it's a good story. So anyway, I came to Hull halfway through, and I got the biggest majority ever. I was here for 3 weeks. Couldn't even have any, all the posters were Vote Randall, my predecessor. There was an MP here in West Hull called Jimmy Johnson back in the 50s and 60s, and someone had got an old crumpled Vote Johnson poster, Johnson for Labour, which was hardly New Labour, and that's about all we had. So even though that, I got the biggest majority ever recorded, and of course, and as people got to know me better, my majority went down gradually every election. And for MPs who think it's their wisdom and sagacity that gets them elected, of course, it's the mood at the moment. There'll be, hopefully, a lot of decent Tory MPs that go at the next election when the Vice-Chancellor of this university is an expert on landslides, by the way. There was one landslide in '97 that I want him to be able to study, and another landslide coming up next year, I trust, or maybe the year after, it could go. So anyway, the fact is that, you know, the political climate had changed. It was an absolute 177-seat majority we won. Boris Johnson talks about his 80-seat majority in 2019 as a landslide. I'm sorry, that wasn't a landslide, as Dave, expert, will say. That's a minor little rockfall. A landslide was 97. And I came in. The reason I got such a big majority was because of that, not because of anything my particular skills.
Well, we'll see. So you went onto great positions of power. And Dave's already said, Secretary of State for Education, Secretary of State for Health, for Trade and for Work and Pensions. And you held one of the 4 great offices of state as Home Secretary. So 2 parts to this. Of what are you most proud and what do you regret?
People talk a lot about that government, about the things, in fact, many Labour Party members struggle to say anything good about that government. But when you look back at it now, and you look at the national minimum wage, and you look at the Belfast Peace Agreement, and you look at the fact that waiting times for hospitals, which was 18 months when we came into power, was an average of 9 weeks when we left power. When you look at building schools for the future, when you look at the eye hospital in Hull, and you look at the cardiac unit, if you look at all the, 2,000 Sure Start children's centres across the country, which were incredible, those early years that we were talking about. But I'm just going on the thing I regret the most, is that we didn't stay to finish. So we set out to eradicate child poverty by 2020. Remember, that was our... and by 2010, when the electorate dispensed with our services, we were halfway there. I mean, it would have been tough through the last 13 years for any government, I agree with that, but austerity was entirely the wrong way to deal with our problems. And it meant that all those great ambitions disappeared. What's the thing I'm most proud of? Trawlerman's compensation, nothing to do with being a minister, although it did help that I was a minister in the same department that had to make the decision on that, because it meant I could nag the Secretary of State. But, our rules are very clear that you can't, if you have a conflict of interest, you can't be involved in it. So I couldn't be involved in that as a minister. But, for 30 years, Trawlerman in Hull, thrown out of work because of a deal done by the British government with Iceland to agree a 200-mile limit. Previous limit had been 5 miles around the Icelandic coast. Suddenly the Icelandic fishing grounds were extended to 200 miles. That was Hull only ever fished, unlike Grimsby that fished in near water and middle water, Hull only ever fished in distant waters. The biggest distant water trawling port in the world. Mortality rate 17 times higher than coal mining. So 900 ships lost out of Hull in 150 years of distant water trawling. That's 6 ships a year lost. That's without the men swept over the side. I mean, such a hard industry and such a terrible carnage in men's lives on the Hessel Road. And it was the men who went to sea, but the women who stayed home, God, they were tough cookies. You know, they had to be. So I was West Hull, that's the fishing community. And these men who were promised in Parliament compensation, promised retraining, promised redeployment, got nothing. Nothing whatsoever, not a single penny. And they were still fighting the battle. British Fishermen's Association, distant water ports, Grimsby, Hull, Fleetwood and Aberdeen. And here was Labour coming in. It was right up my street. It was the kind of issue that, you know, was meat and gravy to me as a trade union official. And in the year 2000, the Blair government paid every penny that the men were asking for. £1,000 a year for every year at sea, capped at 20 years, full payment to widows and dependents. And I love them for this. Part of their charter of what? Full payment to radio officers who weren't fishermen, but who were on the same vessels. And we got every lock, stock and barrel of it. That's the proudest achievement, helping these amazing men. And it really wasn't me. Some of you, it might be your fathers and your grandfathers. These people like Ron Bateman and Ray Smith and all these, you know, they'd left school, never mind at 15, they'd left school at 14 or 12 or whatever. And with stubby fingers, you know, petitions and going up and lobbying Parliament and keeping the argument alive. And just one little thing on this. Ray Smith, dear Ray Smith, he was a big guy, which was unusual for trawlermen. They were usually small. You know, when you're on the deck, I mean, Ray was big. He was 6'2", and you wouldn't want to get in a row with Ray. But he was the secretary of the British Fishermen's Association, and he told me about how difficult life at sea was because you lived by the law of the sea, including mutiny. So when he was a decky learner, he was asked to replace one of the fish filleters. Now the fish filleters used to stand on the open deck in all kinds of weather, you know, 30 degrees below freezing. The fish would come in, they would fillet it with a very sharp knife, and it would go down in a hold onto the ice. In all weathers, as the sea was tossing around, I mean, it was a... And Ray was asked, one of the fish filleters went sick. And the skipper said to Ray, "We want you to fillet fish." He said, I've never held a knife, never mind filleted a fish. He got 6 months in Strangeways for that. He went to Strangeways for 6 months for refusing to obey an order. When he got into Strangeways, he found that the other prisoners were very interested in knowing what he was in there for. You know, there was a kind of hierarchy, the armed robbers at the top and all. Now, Ray didn't like to say he was in there for refusing to fillet a fish. So in a flash of genius, he said, I got involved in a knife crime, which was true. But it shows you what the kind of life was like. And on kind of other ministerial stuff, I was sort of moved around a lot, but the things I did were the things I started but never finished. So one of them, and I'm very proud of them, one was raising the education leaving age. Yeah. So the Great Butler Reform Act of the coalition government in the war, you know, was big. I mean, it introduced grammar schools, but you have to remember, before then, grammars charged for a start, and you weren't allowed to charge anymore at grammar schools, and they also selected by various nefarious methods. Suddenly there was one test, whether you were rich or poor, you had the 11 plus that was going to sort out, you know, sheep from the goats or whatever. So it was a big advance, and suddenly all the schools, you know, everyone was entitled to an education, and everything else, free school meals were introduced. So the Butler Act said that the education leaving age would go up, school leaving age, from 14 to 15, And then it would go up to 16, Butler said, by the mid-50s. Well, that took until the early 70s. And then it would go up to 18, he thought, by 1960. So, you know, the fact that kids could actually disappear out of education altogether, it was ridiculous. So I saw in Canada that they introduced an education leaving age. So you could go to a job at 16, but you could only go to a job if there was proper training, evaluated training there as part of the job. You could go on an apprenticeship, otherwise you stayed in education. So I started that process. I also, this thing called auto-enrollment into pension schemes. So Thatcher had decided that if you had an occupational pension scheme, previously you were automatically part of the pension scheme unless you opted out. We changed it so you had to opt in, and that was something that happened in my time at Work and Pensions. And there was another thing I won't bore you with. But the thing I'm most ashamed of, is not ashamed, but there was one thing I introduced that was a complete disaster, which was the right to have a discipline and grievance procedure in whatever workplace you were in. Civil servants told me it wouldn't work. I convinced them that we should go ahead with it, convinced the government to go ahead with it. Absolute disaster, had to be rescinded. That was my mistake entirely. And also, we didn't build enough houses. We did a lot of double glazing and centrally heating council houses that already existed, but we didn't build enough. You know, Wilson was the great builder of council houses. No one ever matched the level that he reached in the 60s. So we should have done more there.
Loop back onto education. So still thinking about New Labour, and this is a question that was submitted by an audience member, Amy Cheesemond. New Labour famously advocated education, 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 and set that 50% target, as you know. And now more young people than ever do come to university, but not at equal rates across social backgrounds. So do you think higher education can drive social mobility? How do we ensure that everyone can realise the same benefits from higher education?
Undoubtedly, higher education is a major driver of social mobility, without a doubt. When I was born, 2% went to university. When I left school, just after Robbins had reported but hadn't been implemented, that had gone up to around 10%, just about into double figures. Now, the other 90% weren't thick. The other 90% hadn't changed, hadn't failed. There were a whole cohort of them, including me, where going to university, me and my sister never even dreamt about going to university. You might as well thought about going to Jupiter or Pluto. You know, it wasn't for us. And then there were other kids that all their mum and dad went to university, all their brothers and sisters, everyone they knew, all their parents' friends went to university. The world was divided, absolutely, between those. And that was a big part of our awful class system that has held this country back for so long. But, so of course, changing that. Robbins tried to change it, but you know, in those years since Robbins, with very generous grants, the social class gap didn't narrow, it widened. More women went to university, and that was great. They were middle class women, and that's fantastic. But, it didn't help social class at all. I say this in the university at the risk of having rotten fruit thrown at me. I believed in the Deering reforms. As a 15-year-old who left school and paid taxes when I was 18 for others to go to university that people from my family and my background didn't have a chance of going to, Deering saying it should be 50%. He never actually put a figure, but that's what he was implementing. But universities that have been absolutely drastically, criminally underfunded over the previous 18 years under the Conservatives. There was a real problem with university funding. Deering said society should contribute towards universities, businesses should contribute towards higher education, and students, once they've graduated, once they're earning a certain amount, should contribute towards their higher education. I saw nothing wrong with that at all. This idea, higher education has to be free. It does have to be free, up to the point that not everyone can share it. I mean, up to the point where I wasn't allowed to have post-18 education. So at the time when education is not free to where not everyone can enjoy a higher education. And the other thing was, at the time, if you were an adult graduate, undergraduate, you paid a fee. If you were overseas, you paid a fee. If you were part-time, you paid a fee. If you went to the Open University, you paid. Great introduction by one of Harold Wilson's great successes, but you paid. So the only people not making a contribution was a minority, undergraduates, who you mustn't go anywhere near to make a contribution on an income-based. I mean, the argument was a stone bonker, and that's why really most students agreed to it as well. I was the higher education minister who was introducing it, by the way, and I was passionate about it. What's happened since? Osborne's taken away. So what was a big chunk of those fees was going to go in a grant to poorer kids to help them get through. They didn't need a grant. They didn't need to have their fees reduced because they wouldn't be paying it till they were earning at that time 21,000. It's now about 29,000. You paid nothing back. So why would you have a reduced fee when, by virtue of the fact you've got to be earning some money before you can pay it? No, they needed the money to get them through because their parents wouldn't be able to help them. Osborne turned that from a grant to a loan. They turned, the threshold over which you start paying was going to go up with the income. Broke that link. Introduced a real rate of interest. There was no real rate of interest. Now it's RRP plus 3%. And now you have Rishi Sunak, by the way. I'm sorry, I'm not making this a party political broadcast, but I could if you want to go on for another hour. Rishi Sunak said the Prime Minister of this country called higher education, a university education, a false dream, he said. It's holding out a false dream. You talk to the poor kids whose lives have been transformed by coming to university. Now, since fees, by the way, number of free school meals kids coming into university, 10% before our reforms, 25% now. And it's not just about fees or anything, it's about encouraging them to go to university from a young age, helping them make that decision. So yeah, guys, it's an absolutely life-changing decision. And I wish I'd gone to university. I make a thing about my qualification to be higher education minister was that I had no qualification. It was. I mean, Tony put me in a position so that no one could accuse me of pulling up the ladder after me, as they'd been accusing my predecessor. Jeremy Paxman made that mistake when he interviewed me on Newsnight. He opened the discussion on Newsnight by saying, "So, Mr. Johnson, you had the benefit of a higher education with generous grants. Why are you stopping others from enjoying what you..." I was in Who's Who, but I was also in Who the Hell's That at the time. But he only had to, nobody knew anything about me apart from the fact, if they knew anything at all, that I'd left school at 15. So why he made that mistake, and once I pointed it out to him, and people like Tony Benn and Frank Dobson were saying, we had a generous education. Of course they did. When only 3% or 5% are going to university, you can afford to pay them. The final point I say on this, before I bore you all rigid, is that when I said it wasn't that those kids were failing, they had this thing called norm referencing. You know about norm referencing. It was explained to me when I was Education Secretary. It just was moving the goalposts. So to keep higher education as the preserve of a small elite, which has always been, Conservatives opposed what we did on higher education when we introduced tuition fees, not for any benign reason, because they felt you should contract the numbers, that it should be there for an elite. Generally, the kids who parents had shelled out for them to go to public school. Then they would go to university. And then they screamed about paying a fee, having paid huge amounts to put their kids through secondary education. So the norm referencing made sure it stayed a preserve of an elite. So you could do as well as people did last year, but in order to ensure that only so many went to university, the goalpost changed. And what you thought you'd done and achieved to qualify for university suddenly wasn't. That is a pretty barbaric system. And given what's happening in the rest of the world as well, Britain was being left behind. And so I now think, you know, we've got to start circling the wagons. I haven't spoken to Dave about this yet, but Dave, you know, we're going to have a battle in higher education against that notion that it's a false dream. Because, you know, that is probably no prime minister, previous prime minister, Conservative or Labour, would have said that over the last 50 years. But suddenly I feel there's an attack going to be made on higher education.
Thank you very much. And that brings me, I've got lots more questions, but my last one before we open it up to the audience. I think you've already started answering this. How you see your role as the Chancellor of the University of Hull? And do you want to add anything further to? We're going to take the battle out there.
As an ambassador, I mean, I very quickly realised, and I was so grateful when Dave and his colleagues made me the offer. And Dave's going to do great things here. He's already doing great things here. I'm going to take all the credit as the Chancellor. Because the thing you realise very quickly is you have no power. It's a ceremonial role, and that's great. And Virginia did it for 17 years, and she understood that. And I'm not going to be poking my nose in, don't worry about that. I understand this is a constitutional monarchy that I'm involved in here. I shake hands and put a robe on every so often. But I'm a fierce advocate for this university, for everything about this university. I mean, look, how many, you know, I'm a big fan of Larkin. I'm a vice president of the Larkin Society. I came up to Hull when I came to be the candidate with Larkin's collected poems and wanted to know all these places, you know, that are in Larkin's poems that are immortalised, you know, one being sadly Marks and Spencer's in Whitefriars Gate, a big cool store. But also, you know, Richard Hoggart, you know, the uses of literacy I read when I was 25, and it was one of the most fantastic anthems about what we would now call social mobility. Yeah. For God's sake, don't call it levelling up, you know, because that is a phrase that is as meaningless as the big society. But Hoggart was writing about that from his background. He wrote that book, I believe, while he was a lecturer at Hull University, you know. Yeah. So much history in this place, and you know, I'm just proud to be the Chancellor, and you don't need any more ambassadors than the fabulous people who contribute to it, who are here tonight as well, and who help the university because they had the wonderful experiences of coming here. I didn't. When I came to Hull as the MP, I was the only one who didn't. John Prescott had been a student here. Kevin McNamara, of course, was a lecturer at Hull University, and I was the odd one out. So kind of, it's something special to get this. So to be the ambassador for this university is what I see my role as being.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, due to exceptionally poor chairing on my part, we only have a few moments for any questions from the floor. But if you would like to raise your hand if you do have a question for Alan, but wait, and when I've picked you out, that you have the microphone, because otherwise it won't get captured for the recording. Does anybody have an extra question for Alan? Down at the front here, please. No, we need it for the recording, I'm afraid. Oh, no, if you ask, it's all right.
It's all right.
Crystal's on the way.
Do you think that we've got to the stage now where people have to start paying for health through tax, and that neither Labour nor the Tories can really own up to the need to do that?
To pay for health?
To pay for health. In the same way as we pay for pensions through tax and education through taxing as well.
Well, we do pay for it through tax. If you're saying, should we change the way the NHS is funded? What for? To what? To an insurance-based?
An insurance-based system like in Germany or the Republic of Ireland, France, and so on.
Yeah. No, I don't. I don't, and I'll tell you why. First of all, health systems are struggling in those countries as well in terms of what happened post-COVID. But they're also, if we were to change, no politicians go anywhere near changing to that system. And if they want to know how difficult it is to change a system, just look at what Bevan and Attlee went through to create the NHS. You know, bitterly opposed at every level. and bitterly opposed right up until the last minute. In fact, if it hadn't have been done then, it never would have been done. Once we did it, Sweden did it not long after, Canada did it eventually. And in other countries find it really difficult to change the health system that they've got. And if you've got an insurance-based system, you're spending money on health just the same as if you've got a system funded from the taxpayer. You're spending money. But here's the thing. Science is moving on. It's not very long before it's already happening in America, before an insurance-based system would suddenly be saying, well, from your genes, actually, we can tell you're going to get cancer when you're 36. I mean, in many senses, if the NHS didn't exist, we'd have to invent it now because of this kind of thing that's happening. And the one thing that our system is brilliant at is its equity. It's one part of our system where no matter what, my mother could have that heart operation even though she was penniless. It wouldn't happen in any other country or in many other countries. So we've got to keep that, and we've got to ensure that the NHS, which people do respect, but it doesn't become a kind of thing you bow down to. It's got to function properly. Your question is right in that sense. Why are we dealing with so many problems now? Some of it is about funding. Some of it is about recruitment. Some of it is about our absolute obsession with hospital care and primary care as a kind of almost a secondary issue, whereas you can't even get into primary care acute care without going through the GP. So I think West Streeting will sort it out. Be assured once Labour get back in. But we won't switch to an insurance-based system. And I think any look at where we are in society today would say, file it under interesting.
Thank you. We have time for one more. Towards the back, lady in from here, I think a mustard-coloured top. You do. Thank you.
As someone brought up on the Greatfield estate, and therefore did my degree in my 30s,
We're
Hold it a
struggling
bit
to hear
closer.
you.
Sorry. As someone from the Greatfield estate, who therefore did my degree in my 30s, can I ask whether the Labour government that's going to come soon will refocus on lifelong learning like Tony Blair's education government did?
Yeah, I can't speak for the government that's to come, hopefully, but I hope so, because a big problem, there's 15 million adults out there who are functionally illiterate. We don't talk about it anymore. It's kind of disappeared off the scene. This was, we're always told we had a wonderful education system when it was grammar schools and secondary moderns. It was a terrible education system. I passed my 11 plus, my sister passed. I passed mainly because I didn't want to go to the god-awful Isaac Newton secondary modern at the bottom of the Portobello Road. But 80% of kids went to those kind of places. So, and of course it was the grammars that got all the funding, it was the grammar schools that got all the help. And undoubtedly it was transformational for some kids. But for the majority, labouring under a second-rate system, it was awful. But the legacy of that is still with us. And that's why lifelong learning and training right into your, not just basic training. We had a thing called union learning reps, because many people who find reading and writing difficult don't like to talk about it, certainly don't want their friends to know about it. They don't want to talk to the manager about it, but they'll talk to their union rep. And their union rep can open some of these educational opportunities I was speaking about much more widely, and we're doing that. So yeah, I hope they get back to lifelong learning, and I'm sure they will, because it is addressing a specific problem. It's not a nice thing to have as a luxury. It's something that's crucial, because there is an issue out there.
And I think for people as well who are affected by the challenges presented by the changes to technology, who will need further skilling opportunities, perhaps to time in life where they weren't expecting to. They need to have those opportunities to say, I'm still young enough to work, but my job is gone.
Yeah.
So on that happy note, Sorry about that. We are against the clock, and I would like to ask you to join me in thanking the Right Honourable Alan Johnson in conversation with.
Thank you. Thank you.